Hi all, before anybody else comes in. Thank you so much for taking the time to come to the last YOHRS of the academic year and the last semester or last week of the term as well. So great time to host I think is going to be a phenomenal conversation. We have a bit of a different format for today's seminar, which is dialogical in nature, where we have an opportunity to listen to, learn from, and to speak as a whole with two women who are incredible leaders in the cultural sector. It's a huge honor for me to be able to introduce you to Sara, Wajid, and Reyahn King. All I'm going to say about them, because you're going to find out a lot as we're going through the next hour and a bit, is that Sara is head of engagement at the Museum of London and founder of Museum Detox, which is the UK's network of Black, Asian, minority, ethnic museum workers. And Reyahn is chief executive of York Museums Trust, and previously has held key leadership roles with the HLF, with National Museums Liverpool, and with Birmingham Museums and Art Gallery. And you'll hear very much more. I just wanted to say again, it's an incredible honor for me to be able to introduce you to these two people who are amazing and inspirational leaders in the field. And we're going to hear a bit more today about their work on, I think, all sorts of issues related to access and social change, diversity, representation, etc. in the cultural sector. We're going to have about 45 minutes of conversation, sort of chaired by Sara, with Reyahn, and then we will have a bit of time for questions at the end of that. So without further ado, thank you so much.
So I'll kick us off just because, as Sara said, I sort of self-appointed myself as chair of our conversation here. So as a former journalist, I just felt sort of naturally fell to me. So I'll just say firstly how hugely delighted I am. I don't get to out of London very often, and I haven't been to York in 20 years. So when Sara invited me, I thought, what an amazing opportunity to accept that and meet all of you, but also to get to York. And then very quick on the heels, I also thought, Reyahn King is in York. This is the perfect opportunity to have a conversation I've been wanting to have with her for many, many years. So Sara was open to that. That's why I got this plan. Looking at the archive of previous extremely illustrious speakers, I realised that we might be used to extremely heavyweight and dense lectures. This is not that. This is going to be a pretty informal, friendly, nevertheless, I'm sure erudite and very meaningful conversation. But that's the tone. So I'd also say hello to anybody who's watching there online. Thanks for joining us too. I think there might also be quite a few folk of the Museum Detox Network that'll cheer for there. If you're with us, I very much hope you are. So there's very, very, very few people working in the museum sector of Black and Asian minority ethnic heritage. I think one stat has it at about 3%. So this is a historic moment, really, in and of itself. You're very unlikely to find this happening in another room, in another place, probably for the rest of the year. Very unlikely to find two senior Black, Asian, minority ethnic museum workers sharing a platform. So it's a huge honour for me to have this opportunity to be in conversation with Reyahn. And you will know what was written on the blurb, and I'm sure many of you know much about her career, but I'll just pull out a few other things as a sort of kind of indication to some of the themes that we're going to be touching on and some areas of commonality between us. So what you might not perhaps know is also that she's a trustee of the New Art Exchange, which is a contemporary art space in Nottingham, dedicated to culturally diverse contemporary visual arts. You may also not know that her parents met in South Africa, and that she is of mixed British and Cape Malay heritage, and that she is the only person of Black, Asian minority ethnic heritage, of any of those heritages, to lead a major museum in the UK and to be on the National Museum Directors Council. That means she really is a very unique leader in our sector for many, many reasons, but also for those reasons. And a couple of things that we have sort of slightly in common, which I realised talking to her and reading some of her biographical material that I found on the internet, was that we're both of Muslim heritage. That's one thing we have in common. We're both privately schooled, and there's a lesson and a clue in there for you, that we are both, we both have a connection to South Africa, which I hadn't realised previously, which is obviously that Reyahn has heritage, South African heritage, but also that her mother was in the ANC, and my mother is writing a book about an ANC activist, a Muslim activist in the ANC called Fatima Mir, and has a very strong connection to the ANC, and we're both anti-apartheid activists. Both of us have parents who are unionists, and we both worked at the Birmingham Museum Art Gallery at different points in our career. So those are just some sort of little pointers to some of the things in our background. Reyahn's was modern history and second history. Mine was in English literature and then in comparative literature, comparative African and Asian literature. So that also gives you a little hint at different kind of approaches and ways in that we've come into the sector. My kind of story or path has been that my museum career is, I suppose, my second career. I'm an interloper from the world of newspaper journalism, whereas if I've understood correctly, you've been a classic museum worker from the off. So, bearing in mind some of those things, I thought it would be useful to start our conversation by comparing our different relationships or views on material culture, the stuff, museum stuff. It's quite, for me, has been quite a long journey to feel close to collections because, as I mentioned, I came through thinking really about storytelling and narrative and text and archives and two-dimensional primary source material, if you want, was my gateway drug into museums. And I was much more comfortable with archives as a journalist. That felt like a very natural move. But collections and my first engagement and experience with collections as a professional came quite late. I was already sort of at management level before I had anything to do with collections. I'm not one of those people who spent time, volunteering and grubbing around in the stores and dusting things or whatever it is people do. I was interested in stories and collections. Actually, for me, I experienced them quite often as a slightly awkward irritation and problem to the stories I really wanted to tell. There were these problematic collections in the way that I was supposed to incorporate, and that was sometimes quite frustrating to me. Because often the collections were not the ones that I wanted to tell the stories that I wanted to tell at the most basic level. And so really I saw the collections in some ways as the enemy. And it's only really recently that I've started to see that the collections can be, well, that they're very potent, and obviously that's where a lot of the power is, but obviously also a lot of where the meaning and the emotional impact, and that they're the sort of the furnace of museum meaning. So that's my sort of, I feel like I need to kind of confess that to you people, but perhaps there are archaeologists in the room, and so I'm outing myself as a collections or material culture, not refusenik, but sort of like that. How about you?
Gosh, what an admission.
I know. Do with it what you will, and all of you. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's almost exactly the opposite way for me. So I guess I fell in love with art in the first instance. and very much just the experience of seeing it on the wall. I can remember when exactly as a teenager being dropped off outside the National Gallery in Scotland and just wandering around, and like one day I was just thinking, oh gosh, Monet's amazing. It was pretty basic stuff, and I just, from then on, I just became sort of slightly obsessive about going around and teaching myself art in galleries and stuff. So for me, it was very object-led, and I took the opposite journey in a way. So the object-led led me to eventually to art history, via history first, and then as a curator. But my thing about being a curator was always about wanting to share that kind of the amazingness of the object. And I've never been one of those curators who's, now I've got my ambitions to make, which some of my team will not be very happy about, which is that, I actually did 7 years of collections management jobs, but for me that was always just something I had to do. I was never that interested in the kind of nuts and bolts of how things are stored or managed or documented, and I feel embarrassed saying that because a lot of my team do that, and that work is really important. But for me, I was always interested in actually interface with the public and how to get people to be inspired and to share that sort of passion and love that I felt for the objects. And it took me, I think, quite a long time, and it took me going to Birmingham and learning from my peers to kind of really learn about storytelling and interpretation. So I kind of went the other route. So I went from curatorship into interpretation later. And that was very much about just wanting to get better at sharing this amazing stuff.
Do you think, like, having that genuine passion and sort of emotional connection to visual art in your case makes you able to empathise with those audiences who feel like that, but less well able to understand the experience for whom it's just another, it's nothing, the object in itself is nothing special? How do you think it affects your view?
Well, I think I've been lucky in the sense that, my mother has always been interested in, not museums, she doesn't go in museums, but she's been interested in kind of objects, just furniture and that kind of thing. So that, I think, has played a part for me. But my father, who was a scientist, just never got museums at all. And because I did a history degree and went to a college that actually most people who were at that college wanted to end up in not in this world. They wanted to be in politics and those other things. Most of my friends are not in this world. So actually I encounter a lot of people who, don't just get that cultural passion for the object. And I'll always remember going with my father just after I got the job as a curator at Birmingham and walking into a room that had been hung, not by me, but it was a collection that I was responsible for, works on paper. And my father walked in and looked around and just said, well, this is boring. And so he was a great litmus test, for actually, you can't assume that the art speaks for itself. It doesn't. And actually, when I did my art history degree, one of the things that most fascinated me and that I most love about objects now, and particularly that I love about 18th century art, is that actually, there is no such thing as a picture. I used to have an argument with someone at National Museums Liverpool. Well, I might as well say who, David Fleming at National Museums Liverpool. And I was always saying to him, art is not a picture on the wall. Art is not a view through a window. It's all constructed, and it's got messages. And to say that it's not completely loaded with meaning or deceptive is a mistake. And so with the 18th century, I got very interested in the way that there is beautiful portraits of white people who look like bustle in their mouth and elegance and playing an instrument or whatever. And actually, behind all of that elegance, there's this terrible tale of slavery in many cases, of exploitation. And actually, that for me became very much a part of my interest in art and the objects, and how it's kind of, there's so many layers to it. And I think it's a real challenge for museum people to get across all those layers, because actually that is really hard to communicate simply and easily and accessibly. But it's the important stuff.
And you've spoken there powerfully about very special objects with very rich meanings. There are also large proportions of collections which, to my eye, is just brown stuff, which is just like very vernacular, very ordinary. And then sometimes in meetings, people talk about the power of the object, the power of the real object to, grip the audience, and why real stuff matters so much. And in the world of digital and similitude and all the rest of it, we have this amazing, rich, potent power of the object. And I still feel in those conversations that it's this often, particularly with social history collections, it is the story about the object that is really important. And the thing itself, for a lot of people, particularly when they're divorced from it by glass and bad interpretation and all the rest of it, it's often or not, it's not that magical. And sometimes I feel that we should be a bit more honest about that as museum professionals, and that we'd be better storytellers if we said some objects are intrinsically incredibly powerful and potent, and a lot of the artwork that you've described would fit into that category. But what about the huge proportions? I mean, there are 8 million objects in the Museum of London's collection, and I wouldn't like to say how many of those are immediately lend themselves to being, spectacular on display. So there is still, for me, this conundrum about the story and the interpretation, and when that story needs to be celebrated and is really the prime hook. Because so often we come back to this point about, well, it's human stories. When we do audience research, that people say they want to have human stories, and then there's the aesthete and the aesthetic appreciation and all of that. And it's probably a bit oversimplifying. I'm probably oversimplifying, but I still feel this tension between the sort of museum's role and need to celebrate and serve the aesthete, and on the one hand compare back and show objects at all their glory, and on the other hand really talk to people who are not the aesthete, and for whom and objects that are not aesthetically very exciting. And I suppose that kind of leads me a little bit to The Past Is Now, the project in Birmingham. And conscious, we're going to open up to questions in about half an hour. I'm just going to have to basically do a bit of potted presentation. There's the seats there. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with the Past Is Now project, I just need to kind of spend a couple of minutes just explaining what it is so that we can talk about it and then compare it. There was a display which was a sort of experimental display, not meant to be a permanent display, which I worked on I developed really at Birmingham Museum Art Gallery in 2017 as part of a program called the Changemakers Program, which was a sort of Arts Council initiative, a leadership development program, particularly to support, amplify, develop people in the museum and art sector who are either from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds and or disabled people, because these two groups are the people who are the least well represented at leadership level. So there was already quite a change maker context to the project before it began. The initiative was both about ourselves, the 20 of us fellows who were in the program, developing us, but also for us to enact change in the organisations that we were going to. So it's a very privileged situation to be in, being given a budget and permission for a year to go into an organisation and sort of wreak creative havoc with it. And this was come at a point in my career where I'd been working at a National Museum for 5 or 6 years, and it was the experience, the day-to-day experience of being a sort of middle manager in a national museum is the exact opposite of this Changemakers type of program. So to get to it, we basically developed a display that was designed to look at the collections relating to legacies of empire, and to think about the master narrative, master planning process of Birmingham Museum Art Gallery, which is undergoing a massive redevelopment. Sort of, it's over the next few years, it's going to sort of start from scratch, rehang all the collections, so forth. And the director's mission there was particularly to think about how to make the galleries more relevant to the young multicultural audience that is Birmingham, who were not engaging, particularly in the museum. So she had decided, quite rightly, that empire was the real nub, the collections relating to empire, and the conversations that she'd had with various different people, and the conclusions that she'd drawn was that until you tackle this, everything else is sort of window dressing. You have to really get to grips with how Black, Asian, minority, ethnic audiences feel about empire and the museum's displays of them. And so I worked with Rachel Minot, who's a young curator who was appointed specially to the project, and a group of women who are creatives and activists, who are Birmingham-based people who were interested in these ideas. So between the 6 co-curators, the members of staff in the curatorial and community engagement team, myself and Rachel, we tried to create a sort of different atmosphere and different means of production for the whole project. And I was really trying to create what I hadn't seen at the National Museum that I'd been working at, which I thought were the necessary conditions to make this kind of work, was to find an anti-racist kind of creative process, essentially. That was what I had in my mind. And so to do that, you obviously need quite a lot of things to be in place. And we could only sort of really hope to mimic that for a year. But of all the places in the country which I thought we would have a good chance of doing that, Birmingham Museum Art Gallery felt like that place because of their long tradition of co-curation and because they've got the most diverse workforce in the country of any museum service that I know of, and because of their long practice of community engagement, and of course because of the leadership of Ellen McAdam and her vision. So the project was quite controversial. We made work and displays that we would never have done if they were going to be permanent displays, because the museum neutrality question hovers always very heavily over any ideologically inspired type of curation, and particularly in a museum context, not a contemporary art context or temporary exhibition context. That is a very constraining and formidable framework and parameter. So the work ended up being quite different, and we made some of the displays were about eugenics, some of them were about Indian independence, some of them were about Joseph Chamberlain, and they were really seeking to uncover some of the ways and the hidden sort of stories, not just that hadn't been told before by the museum, but to surface the ways that the museum itself had been involved in making some quite dishonest, I suppose, compromises. And so there was a kind of reckoning with the past that we were trying to do in the past is now. And the co-curators pushed us staff to work on and develop text particularly that was much more direct about explicating and calling out museums, essentially. It became their own tool to try and dismantle the master's house, as they say. And those sort of theories and ideas, and the work of Frantz Fanon was sort of in the air, and books like Rennie Edo Lodge's book, Why I No Longer Talk to White People, those were the ideas circulating around the exhibition. Anyway, when the work came out, it was very it was very much to my surprise, actually. It was really, the response was very strong from particularly younger people. I thought that people would, like it. That's what we were trying to do. But I was surprised because it seemed to me not that radical, the content that we've delivered. And I was very familiar with projects like the London Sugar Slavery Gallery at the museum in Docklands, which had done some, the work to some extent was inspired by that gallery and the way that that gallery had been developed. So to me, it was a step forward, but not unimaginable. But it seemed to me that it found an audience for whom this was the absolute first time that they had seen any museum tackle issues around neutrality with honesty and to explicate this in this way. So this was a very surprising kind of response, but it was quite a strong one. So that context that I've described there about the way that the work came about, the other important thing about it is to say that the Museum Detox Network, which I mentioned, the Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic Workers Network, this was a sort of all part of the means of production, because Rachel and I had both been met through that network, and we were bringing to our work the knowledge that we had the support, broadly the support and solidarity of about 250 other Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic museum workers just sort of off stage left. So it's quite vulnerable to put yourself in a position as one of the very, very few non-white workers in the sector as somebody who is both of the institution and trying to challenge it. So we were both kind of trying to keep our jobs and our salaries, thanks very much, but also to have our cake and eat it and say, well, we don't like these things and we need to challenge these things and we need to break down these things. And that's quite a tricky, it's quite a tricky line to walk, particularly because the co-curators were having none of it. Well, you're part of the problem. I mean, we have solidarity with you as women of colour, but equally, you're reproducing these cultural norms, and why do you even work with these people? So this was kind of the tone of the conversation. That's a very long explanation, all of which to say that I wanted to find out from Reyahn about her experience and compare it to this narrative that I've given of the very first display and exhibition that you curated at the National Gallery, which I'll let you explain to the folks what that was and why you'd done it.
Okay. I think I want to say though about the past is now. I went to see that and found it really exciting. And I think what I found exciting about it was actually there were individual labels that I found very exciting. I felt ashamed because there was a Bill gear in there that you explicated, and I had never thought of it in that context, in the Mau Mau context, and I've never even registered that there was that context. I think you, even though I'd worked at Birmingham previously and knew that painting, thought I knew that painting, you actually brought out new meaning. And you did such a good job of uncovering truly shocking practices. I mean, the thing that I found most shocking was the knives, which I won't try and explain, but perhaps you can explain.
Maybe it's
so
worth just explaining. I actually scribbled it down because I thought it was a good one to explain. There's a knife which is it was a knife from the Kikuyu tribe, and it was described in an original catalogue entry by a curator in 1964. It was bloodstained, and this was a very complicated history. And the curator had written that it was an amusing addition to the museum's collection. And you can imagine how troubling that was, for the time. Probably, we hadn't researched for like 6 months to find this. We'd researched maybe a couple of weeks. We didn't have oodles and oodles of research time on this project. So it gives you a sense of within a couple of weeks of tootling around these collections, we would find something like that. Fairly probably common in the 1960s in museum practice, but you would never see it now because museums tidy away, like most institutions do, tidy that away. And I suppose that's because we used that caption in the display and highlighted it, it was, as you say, particularly for other museum workers, it was quite exciting.
Yeah, it was. And I think the other thing I really enjoyed about it was I went a couple of times, and the second time I went, there were loads of black kids in their sort of young teens, I guess. And I felt a little bit guilty because I actually, when I was at HLF, I funded the display of the Anglo-Saxon Horde at Birmingham. I think that's a great exhibition. But it was quite comical because these kids were there, their teacher was saying, we need to get to the Anglo-Saxon Horde, and they really didn't want to leave your exhibition. They were more interested in your exhibition. And I thought, well, that's saying something, that they really weren't engaged in it. I mean, I think I want to pick up on the both working at Birmingham thing, because for me, I felt like through my schooling, I was the only Muslim that I encountered at my there were actually 2 other girls, but in different years, and not in my. This is the kind of school I went to, not in my boarding house. And trust me, it's not like Harry Potter. It's pretty horrible, especially if you're the only Muslim there. And so I had, but the advantage of that schooling was it gave me all kinds of other advantages and ways of being with people in the establishment. So I've always worked pretty much in the establishment. I took a 6-week break and went to the art exchange at one point, which I kind of needed for my soul. But mostly I've worked in the mainstream. And when I moved from London to Birmingham, it was just so refreshing to arrive at a museum that already had 2 BAME curators on the staff. And that was just great. But you asked me about the first exhibition. So I did this exhibition on someone called Ignatius Sancho, who was a slave and born a slave, and ended up, he was never, as far as we know, he was never officially freed, but he ended up in effect free. And doing that exhibition was a very slow burn in my head. It was a very long process of gestation. So I started thinking, when I worked in the documentation job at the National Portrait Gallery in the archive. And part of my job, and this is how old I am, was to type cards, physically type actual card, and then use a sort of iron thing to attach cutouts from auction house catalogues onto pieces of cards that then went into the archive. I mean, that is how old I am. So it's pre-digital, and I used it as an opportunity to sort of teach myself about portraits as I was doing all this cutting and pasting and filing. And but while I was doing it, I couldn't help but notice that oddly, all of the images were of white men in wigs. And when I did get the opportunity to read about their lives, the lives weren't that interesting. In many cases, they weren't that interesting. They just inherited a nice place and lived in it, and had money. So obviously, many of them were interesting, but I just found myself thinking, there must be other stories. There must be other people. There must be other people who've been painted. And as almost always when you work in museums, I didn't do any fantastically groundbreaking research, but I found the secondary research. So I found the literature that told me about how Black people were portrayed in the late 18th century, is what I became interested in, and found the portraits, and people like David Daverdine and Paul Edwards and Polly Root did some fantastic pioneering work decades ago now in this area. So taking that as a kind of inspiration, I thought, gosh, can't we do an exhibition about these people? And I literally just sort of cogitated about it for years while I was doing other work. And then when I did my art history masters, I did what was called like a special module, and you could just do what you wanted, basically. So I took that time to really properly research and come up with this proposal that I then took to the National Portrait Gallery to do an exhibition about this slave. And what was special about him was that he was, if you get the chance, read his letters. They're published by Penguin, and comes across as just a really lovely person. And he wrote in a kind of style that was influenced by Laurence Sterne, so quite sort of fun. And he knew lots and lots of, he ended up knowing lots and lots of artists and writers. And that was what gave me the opportunity to do a show about his life, going from being a slave to becoming a valet, which in our world today, that doesn't sound so great, but he was actually ended up being a valet to the Duke of Montagu, who was the richest man in England. That meant he had the right, the ear of the richest man in England. And that meant that David Garrick and Laurence Sterne and Nollekins wanted to speak to him because he could get them in with the Duke. And he had this very interesting life, and he learned music. He published music, which still is extant, so you can hear his music. And for me, being an object person, the exciting thing was that he's painted by Gainsborough. So we got his painting over from Canada and constructed an exhibition around that. And I think for me, what was really important about that was learning that actually you don't have to have, and again, I think this is quite challenging to many people in museums, you don't actually have to have, you don't always tell a story, you don't always have to have the object. You can have an object that tells the story. And I wouldn't have been able to tell that story without doing that. So I took a painting that was already in the National Portrait Gallery of the Duchess of Portsmouth, and she has a black slave servant next to her. And that slave servant's got nothing to do with Sancho, but it reflected and represented the way of thinking in that period about, having a slave boy as an accessory, as a decorative accessory, and that was what Sancho was at one point in his life. And so I used that kind of thing to tell the story, and I also juxtaposed the beautiful Gainsborough portrait with a harpsichord and all Sancho's lovely tinkly music with slave chains underneath, so which you only saw when you got close, to kind of show that he came out of this exploited situation. And when we talked about it, it was I didn't have a museum detox. I did have the support of various community groups in London. my background up to that point wasn't at all working with communities, so I didn't really know what I was doing, and I had now my husband actually, but I was put in touch with someone who could help me with that, and I got a bit of pushback about not being African Caribbean actually, and I just had to explain where I was coming from, and that as it happened, I probably was the best person available right now to do this show and to make it happen, and I got the in with the National Portrait Gallery. And I think what I learned from it as well was that the process of telling that story can really inspire the next generation. And so loads of people did PhDs on the back of that exhibition. And so a lot more is now known in that area. And I think we sometimes forget as museum professionals that actually an exhibition like the one you did or the one I did can have an impact that goes way beyond what we think we're achieving when we're telling those stories. So I do believe really strongly that it's important to tell the story, and that was why I ended up with the Ignatius Sancho exhibition, because I wanted to, it's so much more interesting to tell the story of one person than to do a sort of generic history of what it was like to be a slave in the late 18th century.
I'm really struck by how you formulated your relationship to operating within an institution, and what you said about navigating establishment sort of cultures and being in those spaces and knowing how to do that. Because I would have found it, the thought of being, I don't know how old you were, but I'm guessing in your 20s maybe, and working at one of the most august establishment conservative probably galleries in the world, not just in the UK, with a collection that is so incredibly prestigious and just the personification of the establishment art collection, and then being a lone worker, as I hear it, the way you've told that story, pitching that exhibition, getting it made, and then working with communities outside to hold the space yourself as an individual, taking the challenge of being told that you're not a black woman, and so what authority do you have to do this work, and then getting the exhibition mounted. I think that takes a very different kind of strength and resilience than what happened with the past is now, and they are very different models, but it's all change. And now I suppose if I've got a question, it's that I had seen individual instances of all sorts of change makers, not just people of colour, making interventions. Like when I started working at the National Maritime Museum, I could see that the woman who was the team leader of the team that I was going into was on a one-woman mission to diversify the museum sector. She was a white woman who had hired almost exclusively black people. And you would walk around the whole museum, and then you come into this department, and it'd be like, there's all black and Asian people working here, and no one could say anything because it wasn't like it's allowed. But like, why are all the other departments all white people? It was really obvious that there's something going on here. There's one woman who just keeps hiring however she can, black Asian, and we became almost like a visible riposte to the rest of the departments. Because it's like, well, we just are. So I don't know why you are how you are. We just are how we are. But she was just this one woman. And what would happen when she left? And what would happen when her practice or her mission to diversify the workforce went with her? And I suppose what we sought to do, and also that people get tired. I saw this time and time again, that people would exhaust themselves, work very hard, and then just either leave the sector or just sort of somehow slightly give up the fight, as it were. And so that's why, as I started to develop into the next level of management, I wasn't thinking consciously at that point, like I need an anti-racist network to bolster me through the next stage of my career. But it certainly was, I'm not going to do this on my own anymore. And I don't intend to go forward as another lone wolf change maker. That's just not me. I'm just too lazy. I don't have it in me. That doesn't look like fun, And also because institutional change is like, everything's so stacked against the individual. Institutions protect themselves. They protect their reputations. That's their ideological state apparatuses. That's what they're designed to do. And so I felt like the ballast or the what became really exciting about Museum Detox was that sense of this isn't just an individual. This isn't just one piece of change making. This is potentially has something to have a legacy, but also a deeper, perhaps more radical form of challenge to the sector, because we're not even a union. We're not even, how would you fight us if you wanted to? Because actually the strength is actually within. It's all about private conversations and consciousness and networks and soft power. So that is something that the sector hasn't tried before. Yeah. And I'm just curious as to how do you, once you're in a position of leadership and extreme responsibility as you are, where do you get that resilience from to have done it kind of more on your own, as it were?
Well, just winding back to the National Portrait Gallery, I mean, I got support from the most surprising people. So I had two people really who, my immediate line manager who went to, believe it or not, Nick Penny and said, Reyahn wants to do this exhibition over there. Because I was working, and it's complicated, I was working at the National Gallery, but in my spare time, at the weekends, I was curating an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery. So to help me out, the National Gallery allowed me to spend my lunch hours at the National Portrait Gallery so I could have meetings and progress the exhibition that way. And Nick Penny, who we all probably know as a person who is, super elite and super interested in, and would say that he really is not interested in anything that isn't elite, I guess. He was very supportive. I mean, he was supportive in a slightly dismissive way. He was like, I think it's really good that you're doing a show and I'm really excited that you're doing research. I don't understand why you want to do that bit of research. And he really didn't understand it until he saw the exhibition. But he was happy to let me try. And then equally there was a curator of 18th century art, Jacob Simon, at the National Portrait Gallery, who was similarly, pretty establishment, mainstream, but just because he was interested in the idea, put his faith in me to be able to deliver it. And but leadership's important because Charles Sumner Smith, I think, had something to do with the decision to let me do it. And also I was just lucky because my proposal sat with them for ages. And they first tried to get me to just give it to them to do, and I was like, no way, no, it's mine, I've copyrighted it, I'll have it. And so that required a level of toughness that I probably wouldn't have had if I hadn't gone to the States and got some good advice from a professor there about how to make this exhibition stay mine. But also Jacob was, very kind of hands off. But they were hands off in a way because they didn't think it was that important. It was in a small space, and so they could kind of risk it. And so that would be always my worry, was the legacy of it. And the proposal sat around until Radio 4 did a radio program about the Black presence, and Sancho was mentioned. And I got a phone call from the National Portrait Gallery the next week, and I think there was probably some connection there. But going back to what it's like being so I felt like I was supported, I suppose is what I'm saying. But there were times when I felt quite lonely, and I had met Gary Morris, who the National Portrait Gallery put me in touch with to get objects for. He was working then at the Transatlantic Slavery Gallery, the thing that preceded the International Slavery Museum, and he was very helpful both in terms of how to work with communities, but also loans of objects. And it's interesting because I guess Gary and I set up our own kind of mini museum detox, because for years afterwards we would do this thing where he would come to wherever I was working for a day, and we'd just walk around and we'd talk about issues. And I would go to Liverpool for a day and we'd do it in our spare time, and we'd talk about issues. And if there was something that was difficult or to do with race or being ignored or struggling or people not understanding, and actually I used to do Black History Month at Birmingham, and that was always terribly stressful. And actually we would often talk to each other about Black History Month and how to make that work. And so in a way, I guess we did set up for ourselves just this tiny little buddy that we could just ring and say, oh, they don't get it. And that was important, and so I was delighted when Museum Detox came about, and And I think it's really important that you've set up this network. And I think the other thing that's really exciting is there's so many people in that network. And you know, I think people who are not in that network might be surprised by the range and diversity of people in the network and the range of discussion and disagreements that happen within the network itself. But it's a good place to be able to have those conversations.
We sort of touched on it very lightly there about our education, and very tiny minority of people in this country are private school educated, and that what you said about knowing, you know, how to negotiate. I went to a minor public school in Essex, and I was private educated at primary school as well, and I know without shadow of a doubt that it's my class privilege and my ability to move and you know, be at home and comfortable basically in the museum most of the time. You know, in most contexts, I'm very similar to the management class. It's really, if I wasn't born in Rawalpindi, I would be almost exactly like them. In many ways, more class privilege actually than some of my white colleagues. So we talk about this within the network Museum Detox quite a lot, about who, you know, what happens then when certain types of privilege allow people space and access to spaces. How do you use that, or how can you use that to break open conversations that other people might not? And I've seen again and again in the last particularly the last 4 or 5 years since I've been talking regularly to hundreds and hundreds of other Black, Asian, minority, ethnic workers in the sector, that it is those who depart most strongly from the management class in their identities who suffer the most, basically, who are subject to bullying, subject to being marginalised, short-term contracts, all of that stuff. It's basically the working class Black workers who in many ways are closest to the audiences in their own profile that we talk about when we talk about widening audiences or audience development and all of that, who themselves are very, very unlikely to get through that management bottleneck. And so that's the other reason why I think that within the network it's interesting, because we're not just the one, we're then able to reflect and be more self-reflexive and think about privilege and power, how it operates within ourselves, and to look at that and then take that back to our workplaces a little bit more sort of clued up on that and see how that operates. And we also have examples from others, not just drawing on our own individual career trajectory. And we can see, obviously, when we look amongst ourselves, who the people are who are in the more prominent roles or in the senior roles. Why do we keep seeing these patterns? You know, why is it there's such a high proportion of the men, for instance, in the network are gay men? Why is that reproduced? We see that reproduced in the rest of the sector. Is that about fathers and parenthood? What you know, we kind of can interrogate this stuff a bit more forensically. So that's just me ranting on now. I haven't got a question. You know, I suppose the question is, as a director, you know, as a leader, you know, what can you do to sort of, kind of bring these issues out in your museum's trust?
Well, I think it's a hard one in the sense that there's two things that I think operate, and it also depends in what context you're working as well. But I think that you know, a clarity about the things that you can do is important. So something that I'm proud of having achieved at HLF, which I then have insisted on at York Museums Trust, is that at HLF they now always will ask any interview candidate a question that relates to equal opportunities and diversity in relation to that job. So, you know, they figure out, well, usually they actually ask the person, what do you think is relevant to these issues to your job? Because that's actually a very revealing question. And that was down to me saying, you know, I think there's a really simple way that we can make sure that when we recruit, we're not only recruiting, we can recruit people who are from diverse backgrounds, but that isn't why I made that change. It was more saying, actually, we work with all these communities. HLF actually, more than 50% of NLHF, as it is now, funding goes to small community groups, not to the big projects that we think of. In terms of the number of grants, it's going out to loads and loads of, you know, Yemeni, Somali, Irish, whatever, community groups. And so it's really important that the officers treat those groups with the appropriate respect and the right approach. And so I thought that question was really important for everyone to be able to answer if they're going to be appointed to work at HLF. And we've taken that version of that question through into York Museums Trust, so that's something that you're always going to be asked on those questions. And that's a really small thing, it's not changing the world, but it is very incrementally kind of just making sure that people are thinking about those questions right from before they even enter our organisation. I think one of the things that's really difficult about being a CEO is just finding time to do anything well. And so, I think I feel, as I do in a lot of areas in my job, that I don't do enough at the moment. And then if I'm really honest, I think there's one other thing that actually makes it almost harder for somebody from a minority in a leadership position to act on injustice or to act on any of these issues. And that is that and I think I felt this, if a white person were to raise an issue, as I did recently at NMDC, about Muslims being on the receiving end of actually genocide in the case of the Rohingya, and I raised at NMDC, I think we should be formally writing to the British Council and objecting to the fact that they're working with this country that is being accused of genocide. But it tires me that it's me who notice that the British Council are doing that, and that actually somebody ought to object to this. And it tires me that it's me who also made an objection to something else that NMDC was going to do, and that I thought was racist actually. And there's a danger as well for us in these positions, which is that you become seen as the person, the chippy person who's always talking about these things. And it doesn't matter if it's actually only the once in 20 times that you raise that kind of issue, and the other 19 things that you've talked about have been about something else. I've definitely seen in my career a tendency to kind of remember when I've done things that kind of fit a box that some people want to put me in, and not remember some of the other things. So actually that acts as a slight kind of self-censorship thing, because you want to keep your job, but you also want to have a perception as being a kind of a sensible person with a sense of balance, and you're aware that people don't see you in that way, depending on what you're arguing for. I don't know if that's made sense, but that's I think quite a difficult thing about being a leader in this position. And there are examples of CEOs, particularly in the arts actually, who have lost their position over being kind of cast as not actually able to do the full leadership role because they've been very active in one particular area. And I don't think that would happen to people who are kind of fitting more of a mainstream box, and everybody's individual. And I think the key thing, I'm looking at the clock and thinking of questions, but there's one thing I suppose I would just say, which I think is a theme that's coming through here, which is that everyone who can, and white people particularly, be an ally, and don't. One of the things I've noticed is sometimes that people are not allies because they're a bit nervous about getting it wrong. But don't worry about getting it wrong, because people will know if you're coming from the right place. And so actually, we need allies. We need our own networks and our own support mechanisms, but we also need allies for these things. And I would like to get to a point at NMDC where it's not me who points out the thing that, that actually one of the other people points out something.
Great, I think that's a good time, as you say, to ask if there are questions, because we've got 20 more minutes. And I think we'll be sure.
Yeah, I'd like to ask probably to Reyahn being the most appropriate one. If you take the example of the Slavery Museum in Liverpool,
yes,
and you also say to the fact, I've been an archaeologist for a professional for 10 years now, and I can count on one hand the amount of ethnic minority colleagues that I've come across. I've worked with loads of Black and Asian engineers, but very rarely am I working with Black archaeologists. As they're so underrepresented in a studying position, how do you find somebody who is appropriate to take on the role, say, of leading the Slavery Museum? Because especially when you look at the community groups that work in a city like Liverpool, where you mentioned the class issue earlier, there is already a distrust amongst the people because whether you're black or white or purple or whatever, you're still posh in comparison, and that is the attitude a lot of these community groups are having. So how do you, I guess the question is, how do you really make archaeology open culturally to people from black and ethnic minorities?
I have to say, archaeology, I don't know because I don't know your sector well enough. But if we're talking about museums, you know, I do think there's actually a question about retention, because when you talk about International Slavery Museum, you know, I did marry the man who gave me the advice about the community exhibition stuff, who worked at the Transatlantic Slavery Gallery as it was. And you know, Gary didn't stay in the sector. He felt in the end that he couldn't do the things that his passion was about in the sector without being, you know, pigeonholed and stuck. I suppose I should say he's African Caribbean, so you know, he was absolutely passionate about that project, the one before the ISM. And so I think my point is that retention, the two curators that I mentioned who were working at Birmingham museums when I started, they're no longer, one of them is freelance and the other I'm not sure about, but they're not in positions of authority that in my view they could have been in. And so I think there is a real question about retention. So there might be some people, if you ever see, you know, if you look at, you know, the archaeology sector, and there are people, it's also about keeping people and not allowing people to feel so alone that they end up leaving the sector. I think that's kind of really important. And then there's some really good initiatives like Changemakers, also like Diversify. Do you remember there was that one? Was that the name of the museum association scheme? Diversify, which did bring BME really good people into the sector. And interestingly, and I feel this really passionately, and having said that, an answer, I'm now rambling on, but I do feel really passionately that there's a kind of an assumption that in order to get, for example, BME people into the sector, you have to change the standards, and I don't agree with that. I think actually a lot of the reason why people are not in the sector is because they just think it's not interesting and it's not well paid. And you know, there are more high prestige jobs out there. And
well, I did want to say that like a lot of the BME people that I went to school with, their parents like pushed them into going into medicine and law, as opposed to going into like arts. So without having them at the base level being trained, how can you put them into a curatorial position?
That's right, and so we have to prove our relevance and why we're important. I think that would make a big difference.
And we were just talking before we came to here about the few Asian archaeologists that I know through the network. There's a woman who was on Time Team, her name is Raksha, but we all know each other. Like there's like 5 people. The Raksha, Subhadra Das, who was at college at UCL with Raksha, was trained in archaeology, but then left archaeology because of finding it a very difficult discipline to be thinking about decolonial ideas in. And then I was mentioning Professor Uzma Rizvi, who's based in the States, who does decolonial work in archaeology. And she was the first person I met who said, yeah, these things are really problematic at the heart of archaeology, but I'm going to stay within the discipline and try and bring the challenge into the discipline. So although I'm not saying that any of them came through like diversity schemes or that any of them are necessarily from working class backgrounds, I don't know what their backgrounds are, but I would venture a guess that they're probably from a relatively kind of, you know, in terms of being able to earn, you know, what archaeologists earn and do all of that stuff. They're probably from the positions where they can do that. But I think what's interesting about their careers is that Sub left archaeology and that, you know, there's a sort of exceptionalism there, isn't there? The one Asian archaeologist, she's on telly, but she's actually the famous Asian archaeologist. And there are so few that I think within archaeology it needs to look at itself in the same way as history and museum studies and art history needs to look at itself and think about all of the barriers, which are class, race, all of them, and look at why people are leaving and really kind of do a lot of thinking about that. So that's my 2 days work. There's another question.
I just want you to both talk a little bit about something that you're working on right now that really excites you.
I can go first one. Yeah, so I work at the Museum of London, and we are building a new museum. I suppose what really excites me about that is that the London Wall site has been there for about 40 years, and my role is as head of engagement to democratise the process of shaping a new type of urban museum. And Birmingham was a really interesting moment to think about civic museums, particularly in citizenry and what museums mean in a city, because national museums have this sort of rather a bit of a cop-out sometimes about audiences, because like, we have to be for everyone, so we can't really think about these special people. And they never really, they never really kind of grasp the nettle of issues around cultural access and democracy and elitism and access to culture. But civic museums haven't got that out. They are large enough to have clout and collections and expertise and capacity to make change, but still located in a place, and they have a duty to that particular place and those particular people. So that relationship with audience is a powerful one, and it's actually a really interesting engine and context for thinking about, sort of our culture basically, and our society, and what kind of societies we want to live in, and what a museum can be in all of that. And London is incredibly, it's like such a complex context to work in. Like any big megalopolis. I suppose what excites me at the moment is the idea of how we are starting to change our curatorial practice at Museum of London to break that open. And some of the work that Helen Graham is doing here in York is about the My Castle Gateway project, is a thing that is really inspiring me. And I'm looking forward to. I'm stealing your thing. Sorry, I stole your thunder. So that's another really exciting thing about being here, is this chance to really talk to Helen and understand more about how that work we can bring in some of that practice.
Yeah. So and my thing is actually around the Castle Museum. And the funny thing about being a CEO is it's more about trying to enable and encourage things to happen. So you don't do that much. So the things that other people are doing that I'm excited by is around the Castle Museum, and two things really. One is the work that our research team are doing into thinking differently about our collections. We had a meeting about that today. Kat Oakley is there at the back and just bringing in lots of very exciting ways of thinking about the collections. And we're discovering new stuff and new ways into the collection. And we're looking at the site for the first time as a site, so the castle and the prison, and not just as a repository for a museum. And that by doing that, we're looking and finding new things in the collections that we hadn't really thought were that relevant to the site. So that's very exciting, and the approach that Kat would be able to talk about much more eloquently than me is really exciting in terms of we're taking the time to kind of really do proper research, but also think about things like witchcraft and what that says about the history of how women have been treated and so on. So that's very exciting. And the other thing, which is about the My Castle Gateway work, which Helen Graham has done, is that has led me to feel very strongly that the fourth objective, so we have 4 objectives for the Castle Museum project. And one is about 21st century visitor experience, all the things you'd expect. One is about a sense of place and telling the heritage of the site. One is about a museum that's recognised as the national collection of everyday life. And the fourth objective, which is the one I think that excites me and that I feel most responsible for, has come out of the consultation. And that's very much the feeling that actually what we need to do as a museum is not think about this opportunity to bring in money and development and new building as about being a museum project, but it's actually about being a project that would give the city what it wants for that part of town. So creating a destination in its own right is how we've talked about it. But what I mean by that is listening to the work that Helen's done and others have done about what residents want. And they say that they want a place where they can look at the river. And actually that sounds like we've got 2 rivers, why can't we look at it? Actually, if you are a York resident, quite often you feel like you have to pay to sit at a bar and look at a river. So quite simple things like looking at the river, having a space to just sit and enjoy. And we've written that into our architectural brief and talked very much about a landscape and architectural intervention in order to make sure that's in the brief. And similarly, using our site to unlock new cycling and pedestrian routes through the city. And I think that's about being a good citizen, and that is actually, again, about making museums relevant, because if we can show that we can use the building opportunity and the money opportunity to bring money in to unlock that end of town, make it somewhere wonderful for people to just be, then, you know, I'll be happy, even though that isn't your normal museum goal. I think it's actually really important for us to show that we are the museum that belongs to the City of York. We are a museum that cares about the people of York, and that's us being a civic museum. In a way, doing that does it as much as any collection story about the history of York.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I wonder if you could say something about the wider political agenda and how the anti-intellectualism, anti-arts rhetoric, which seems to be surrounding both higher education institutions and the arts more generally, what is our role? What is our lobbying, campaigning, unifying role in that? How do we work together, particularly higher education and museum sector, to counter that narrative that we don't need the arts and that the value of a degree can be measured by how much you earn when you graduate? These are things that I think, to come back to Reyahn, how do you encourage people to come into the sector if that's what we're telling our youngsters, that the only measure of value in life is how much you earn when you graduate? It's very, very worrying. So what do we do about that?
I think there's lots of, there's a kind of multi-pronged approach that you need to take, and again, some of it is about being relevant, because in a way, journalists are saying that on one level I care because they have influence, at another level I don't care. What I care about much more is, if you like, an average person and how they feel about intelligentsia, if you like, or experts or whatever. And I think it's a really interesting balance, because I think on the one hand I feel really passionately about a project that we're just about to launch called the Museum of Broken Relationships, which is not our concept. It's a concept from Zagreb, and they have this museum of broken relationships, and the idea is you give an object and the story around that object that tells the story about your broken relationship and how you feel about it. But we are deliberately launching it just before Brexit Day, if it happens. And one of our key pieces in there is a jigsaw that we have in Europe, which conveniently can be pulled apart, put together. And what we're trying to do with that exhibition is, once it's opened, we want to use that as a way to really listen to people, not on both sides of the Brexit argument. I really hope we get people on both sides wanting to give objects and wanting to talk about how they feel, because I think it is really important to treat people with respect. And I thought, I'm not answering your question, but I think one of the reasons that we almost deserve some of that criticism is because I felt that around Brexit and after Brexit, I felt that our museum sector was very sort of, oh God, we didn't know all those stupid people were out there. And that's how it came across to me, with lots of people writing things about, we don't understand these people, and we haven't, how did we not know? Well, actually, that's our problem, not their problem. And there was all this heart-wringing, all this hand-wringing, but I haven't seen much in terms of museums that are actively trying to listen. And I think, given where we are, we remain, York voted Remain, all its hinterland didn't. A lot of our audiences at the Castle Museum won't have voted for Remain. So I really want to understand that, and I think that's our duty. So, but then, having understood that, I think it's really important that we tell the truth when we know the truth and don't shy away from it. So to not be afraid of that. And the example I'd give there is when I worked on the Birmingham History Galleries, we had a community panel going through all the stories, and one of the things that came back was that the panel didn't want us to deal with the pub bombings at all because it was too painful. And I had to go back to them and say, I'm sorry, we cannot tell the story of Birmingham without telling the story, but trying to then understand what was so painful and how we could deal with it sensitively. Does that sort of answer the question?
I don't think there's an easy answer.
Yeah.
It's a big challenge.
Yeah.
I suppose one of the areas that has been interesting between higher education and museums has been the debate about decolonising the curriculum, and that's where it's perhaps more easiest to talk about the alliances. and I've been surprised by how little I have seen between museums and historians around this issue. And I think it's because it's, you know, let's face it, it's mainly white people working in museums. A lot of people feel very uncomfortable about going towards an issue which they think they're only going to come out of this badly. If they take any public position, if they engage. I think Tristram Hunt is one of the few museum directors who's been more inclined to talk about repatriation and talk about decolonising. And there, I think it's people like Indy Andrews in Birmingham with the Black Studies degree that have been leading the conversations really about decolonising the history curriculum. And the history kind of, establishment has been remarkably quiet about both the national curriculum and the question of decolonising, as if it might go away. I think that people are hoping that it will. And I think museums need to start stepping up a bit, because on one hand, we as practitioners sometimes think, well, we've got our hands full over here, but actually the relationship between us and what's happening with like who's studying history and who's coming out of those history degrees into our museums or not coming out of them are extremely closely aligned, but we don't seem to join up around these things and think more laterally and politically, as you say, about the sort of wider climate. The only other place I've seen museum people kind of really taking a kind of waking up around this crisis around sort of the arts and the sort of education field is around the cutting the art history A level. And again, it's been a rather effect sort of flapping of, you know, hands around, art history. And again, because it's seen as the province of privileged, white women, essentially, who are doing those degrees at Courthold and so forth, it hasn't exactly been a barnstorming call to arms.
I think that's really interesting in terms of that relationship about people believing the truth and experts, because a lot of the work that you did, the work that I've done, it's actually been very simply, it's been about telling the truth, telling the truth about what happened, not just to white people, but to other people in the 18th century, in the case of my show on Ignatius Sancho. And I think we have to hang on to that and be really loud about that, whether it's talking about decolonising or talking about other things. So I think, and one of the things that most shocked me over the last few years is when Mary Beard talked about finding, that there were many black Romans, and we have one of those, a North African woman in the Yorkshire Museum, who was obviously a rich Roman woman who lived in York, of North African descent. And it was amazing to see the amount of sort of Twitter storm with people saying that she was making it up, basically. And that was the sort of moment when we can engage and say, well, we've got evidence here. And I think that's really important to try and just keep doing that.
I think time for one last question, if there is one. Again,
I have a question. So my question is, not to surprise anyone back there, it's an ethics question. When you're looking at adding to collections now, I've seen that you've talked a lot about decolonizing objects that are in collections. What do you consider to be the ethics of continuing to add to collections when we know that there are such dubious practices around how many of these objects are in collections?
do you mean what are the parameters around contemporary collecting?
Yeah, like what is your approach to continuing to add to collections in an ethical way that doesn't support necessarily some of the problems we've seen in the supply chain of providing artifacts and objects to museums and galleries?
I would really hope now that the Museum Association ethical position is pretty clear about the need for clear title and clear understanding of where something came from. So I would be really appalled if we were to repeat the mistakes of the past in that particular way, in terms of acquiring things that were not appropriate for us to acquire. And I would hope that any curator working in that area would be sensitive to those issues.
So I recently became a trustee of the Pitt Rivers Museum, and I've been really inspired by the work of the director there, Laura Van Broekman, who has sought to sort of take the work that people like the Museum Ethnographers Group and other anthropologists and others have been doing for a long time actually, but walk the talk, because a lot of talk has happened about what ethical practice is, but I've seen the difficult conversations being platformed and done productively and in a way that role models for the rest of the sector at Pitt Rivers. And I don't know how much you have looked at Pitt Rivers.
I have a lot, yeah.
Okay, well then that. And on that note, I think people probably would like to get out of this warm room and to have a refreshing drink. Thank you so much for joining us, and this has been a real pleasure, and it's been a real pleasure for me, particularly to meet Reyahn and have this conversation. So cheers and bye.
I'll say a final thank you